party labels aside and fall in line behind the chief executive during times of great national strain?
Well, we've done it over and over again, and clearly we will do it this time as we have so often in the past, as we did in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, as we did indeed after the riots in 1967 and 68. We recognize that we're in a situation where we're going to have to act together. We're going to have to act to be unified and put partisan bickering to one side as rapidly as we can.
Is there anything worse about this vis-a-vis Pearl Harbor in that we still don't know who the enemy is?
Yes, that's certainly right. There you could focus on a particular enemy, find ways to combat this, but under present circumstances, we're going to have to take some time and find out who did it and how to react.
Well, Mr. Secretary, after what's been a very tough day in this country, when you look back at the events of the last couple of hours, you look at what had been passing for domestic political issues, in addition to this changing day-to-day life in the country, do you think this will change the access of the entire argument? Do you think this will increase now interest in things like your stock and trade, foreign affairs?
There's no doubt that it will. I think we're going to have to understand where this came from. We're going to have to understand who our enemies are around the world, and we have to understand who our friends are. I would hope and expect that all the civilized world will join us in combating this, not just our NATO allies, but China and Russia as well. We need to get together in the civilized world to combat this. And on Capitol Hill, I think there will be a whole new set of issues. I don't expect to hear much talk about what happened to the surplus in the coming days.
Did we get too lax? Did we get too carried away with the end of the Cold War?
Yes, I think there was some laxity, much as there was before Pearl Harbor. We perhaps were too confident about we are a long ways away from the terror of the Middle East. I'm not saying this came from there, but it bears many of the earmarks of that. 4 suicide bombers or groups of suicide bombers, because those planes probably weren't taken over by a single person. You can just imagine what went on board those planes. So it bears some marks of a society, a group of people that we simply don't understand and can't comprehend. But that doesn't mean we can't take full action in meeting it, even though we may not be able to comprehend it tonight as we sit in our stunned concern for the people of New York and Washington, D.C.
Former Secretary of State Warren Christopher, as always, sir, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Brian.
For those of you watching us on the NBC television network, stay tuned for a special 90-minute edition of NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Special edition of NBC Nightly News. Terrorists declare war on the United States, hijacking jetliners, crashing them into New York's World Trade Towers. Another airliner into the Pentagon, threatening the seat of national power. Thousands likely dead. Downtown New York in chaos. America wondering, what next? On Midtown Manhattan, and tonight America is at war with terrorists after a stunning series of attacks today against targets in New York and in Washington, D.C., the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The terrorists used hijacked civilian airliners and their passengers as guided missiles in their attack. The most serious attack on this country since Pearl Harbor, and tonight, the dead still are being counted. An unknown number still are missing. At this hour, in this war, another development, there are reports out of Kabul tonight, the capital of Afghanistan, of explosions, but the Pentagon and the CIA are flatly denying that the United States had anything to do with those explosions. This has been one of the darkest days in America, and it is not yet over. Here at home now, a quick look at the locations where the 4 airliners hit. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, 20 minutes apart. Then, within an hour this morning, the Pentagon. And then, the final crash just minutes later, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, 266 people on the 4 airplanes alone, all presumed to be dead. At the World Trade Center, even more than 9 hours now after this disaster began, officials do not know how many people were killed, how many still are trapped in all the rubble. We do know that on most days there would be at least 20,000 people at work in the World Trade Center at the time If the airliners crashed into those twin towers, another 90,000 could be expected in the vicinity of those towers in the course of an average workday. And of course, scores of police, firefighters, and other emergency personnel were in the area when the buildings came down. We're going to get the view now from the White House and our correspondent there, Campbell Brown, also from the Pentagon and from Jim Miklaszewski. And I'm going to join now with a complete account of what this day has been like from NBC's David Bloom, who's been my colleague all day long. David, bring us up to date.
Well, Tom, more than 9.5 hours since the first attack, the smoke billowing from the hulks behind me is now more gray than black, indicating that the fires have diminished somewhat, but it's still an extremely dangerous situation. Just within the last hour or so, a third building, a 40-story building, also collapsed. 40 more stories of concrete, steel, and iron crashing to the ground. A makeshift morgue has been set up near the World Trade Center. New York City police still sticking to their early estimates that the casualties ultimately may number in the thousands. Nothing more precise than that. We've put together a chronology of the events as America's watched, dumbfounded, and yes, outraged and defiant. The first attack plane, a hijacked American Airlines flight out of Boston, slams into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center at approximately 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time. The explosions and fireballs broadcast live by television helicopters, which then, horrifically, spot the second attack plane, a United Airlines flight hijacked from Boston, taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's South Tower. It's now approximately 9:03 a.m.
Hey, where the hell can I meet you? I'm across the street from the Marriott, man. An airplane, a 727 just ran into the building.
Emergency officials estimate 20,000 or more people may have been inside the two 110-story buildings at the time of the attacks. Eyewitnesses report victims falling, and in some cases, jumping from the two buildings.
But there were people falling out of the sky.
At 9:29 a.m., President Bush in Florida addresses the nation for the first time.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
But in the nation's capital, just 11 minutes later, 9:40 a.m., a third hijacked plane, an American flight out of Washington Dulles, crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, the plane's wreckage tearing a gaping hole into one side of the building. Federal buildings are evacuated, government leaders taken to secure hideouts. 9:59 a.m., the until now unthinkable, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside, including the rescuers, firefighters, and police who'd gone in trying to save lives. Then at 10 a.m., hundreds of miles away in western Pennsylvania, a fourth hijacked plane, a United flight out of Newark, crashes 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. 1/2 hour later, 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In all, 266 people aboard 4 hijacked planes are killed. Untold others in Washington and New York missing and presumed dead. In New York, a defiant Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
The city of New York in the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists.
For the first time in U.S. history, the Federal Aviation Administration closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace until at least noon tomorrow. The U.S. military and American embassies worldwide placed on the highest alert. Navy aircraft carriers and destroyers deployed along the eastern seaboard. The president, now in Louisiana, speaks for a second time.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
The president is then taken to the secure Strategic Air Command in Nebraska, meets with his national security team via teleconference before boarding Air Force One to return to Washington. But in New York late this afternoon, a third damaged building, the 40-story World Trade Center number 7, also crashes to the ground. And emergency officials allow the first camera crew from NBC News inside the smoking hulks of the Twin Towers. Ground zero, cars overturned, steel torn apart, glass shards, small fires still burning. The very picture America most feared, the image terrorists most wanted. As to who might be responsible, a senior American intelligence official tells NBC News tonight that they are now, and I'm quoting here, 90% certain that Osama bin Laden, the Saudi-born terrorist, was responsible for today's attack. This official tells NBC News, quote, "This is not just surmise, this is new information." The president plans to address the nation from Washington, D.C. tonight. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's David Bloom. And we're going to go now to Washington, where NBC's Campbell Brown, who covers the White House, is on duty, but across the street from the White House. The president is expected back there shortly. Campbell?
Tom, the president is on his way back to Washington tonight. We're told that Air Force One is being escorted by F-15 fighter jets on each wing. As David said, he is planning to address the nation tonight. One aide says his message will be one of resolve and reassurance. And Tom, we are reporting to you tonight a block from the White House at a hotel. That's because those of us in the White House press corps, along with White House staff, were rushed out of the White House this morning as the entire complex was evacuated. Needless to say, this has been an extraordinary day for the president. One aide says when he spoke with his national security team in a live teleconference today, he said, quote, "We will find these people and they will suffer the consequences."
Yes.
The president at a Sarasota, Florida elementary school about to begin a reading event gets first word shortly after 9 a.m. in a phone call from his national security advisor. One plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. Minutes later, Chief of Staff Andrew Card leans over and whispers in the president's ear. The reaction on Bush's face, the first sign of more horrifying news. A second plane has now hit the World Trade Center with all indications this is a terrorist attack.
Today, we've had a national tragedy.
As Bush speaks, chaos at the White House. Staff and press are ordered to evacuate. People run from their offices across Pennsylvania Avenue. Crowds pour into the streets as buildings nearby are evacuated. People gather around car radios for any information. Fire engines blaze toward the White House. Shortly after 9:30 a.m., the president's national security team is in the Situation Room, a secure communications center in the basement of the West Wing. Vice President Dick Cheney is there, along with National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. Meanwhile, the president leaves Florida, his destination at takeoff a secret. We later learn he's landed at Louisiana's Barksdale Air Force Base. There, he pledges, the U.S. will retaliate.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
The president then flies to the Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, the U.S. Strategic Air Command Center. We're in a bunker there. He convenes a national security meeting, joining his team live by teleconference. Back in Washington, his top advisor, Karen Hughes, insists the White House has the situation under control.
Your federal government continues to function effectively. We have a federal emergency response plan, and at President Bush's direction, we are implementing it.
By telephone, the president calls New York Mayor Giuliani and New York Governor Pataki. He also speaks with First Lady Laura Bush. The First Lady and Bush's two daughters are also rushed to secure secret locations. Mrs. Bush, on Capitol Hill when the attacks began, tries to offer words of reassurance.
Well, parents need to reassure their children everywhere in our country that they're safe.
We have just learned that Air Force One has safely landed at Andrews Air Force Base just outside of Washington. From our vantage point, we can see sharpshooters on the roof of the White House tonight, Secret Service patrolling the grounds, police cars driving up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House in a lockdown as we wait to hear what the president has to say to the nation. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. And there are so many questions, but a major question tonight. How could they hijack 4 civilian jetliners in such a precise fashion? How do they pull all that off? Our aviation expert is NBC's Robert Hager, and he's standing by now in Washington as well. Robert?
Tom, 4 airliners turned into deadly weapons. There's a nationwide hold now on all commercial flights. That's the first time that's ever happened in our nation's history. And it lasts at least until midday tomorrow and might last longer than that. And there are also some chilling first details of what may have been going on in those cockpits. But first, the facts. The string of events that results in these 4 horrific crashes begins at Boston's Logan Airport, 7:45 a.m. American Flight 11, 767, with 92 on board. Supposed to fly Boston to Los Angeles, but over New York State, it's diverted, forced to fly south. directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A long day of carnage is underway. Back in Boston, United Flight 175, another 767, with 65 aboard, is already in the air, also bound for Los Angeles, 15 minutes behind the first flight, when it too is hijacked. This, the actual plane, as it hits the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:10 a.m., American Flight 77, a 757 with 64 aboard, has taken off from Washington's Dulles Airport, also bound for Los Angeles. It too taken over and loops back into the Pentagon. It slices in at an angle, leaving a deadly and ugly gash in the nation's military nerve center. And finally, 8 a.m. out of Newark Airport, United's Flight 93, a 757 with 45 aboard, bound Newark to San Francisco, hijacked as well, but crashes short of whatever its intended target is, comes down in rural western Pennsylvania. Eyewitnesses there.
And I heard a loud noise, and I happened to look up, and it was a plane. It was real low to me. It sounded like it was running fine to me. I just kept watching. I watched it go nosedive straight into the ground.
You could see where the plane had made the initial impact in the ground, and it was still on fire. It made a crater probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's probably 15 or 20 feet deep, and there's just debris scattered within probably a half-a-mile radius.
There are only two ways terrorists can sneak themselves or their weapons aboard planes, either through passenger screening or by going unscreened through locked doors into off-limits areas or onto the tarmac. Periodic FAA tests have found plenty of flaws. Found when government agents tried to sneak into secure areas, they were successful more than 2/3 of the time. Found testers also often able to sneak fake guns and explosives by X-ray screening. Once aboard, many speculate the hijackers must have disabled crews and taken over the plane's controls. More likely that than forcing a pilot with a gun at his head to fly right into the World Trade Center, for instance. Former American Airlines pilot Jim Tillman.
It is inconceivable to me that any airline pilot would allow anyone to force him to fly into an inhabited building. I cannot imagine how any pilot could be conscious or capable of doing anything to control that airplane at the time that it was directed at one of these buildings.
Terrorism specialist Neil Livingstone.
I suspect that what we're going to find is that the pilots were overwhelmed, perhaps dead already, and that trained pilots from the hijacker camp were in charge of those aircraft and were willing to die for their beliefs.
If there was time, if there was, the crews may have been able to press a button in the cockpit and send out a coded warning to controllers that there was a hijack in progress. Controllers may then have radioed back inquiries. But if the crews were disabled, the controllers would have been left in the dark for real information. Whatever else, controllers must have been surprised, in disbelief. There hadn't been a commercial plane hijacked in the U.S. for 10 years, since 1991. And now this. There are several unconfirmed reports around that give little glimmers of what may have been going on in the cockpits. There's one from a controller in New Hampshire who says that a microphone was left on in the first plane of the day that was hijacked, that the pilot had his microphone keyed so it was picking up the what was going on in the cockpit, and that the controller then, off at the control center in New Hampshire, heard a terrorist say in English, "Don't do anything foolish." Then after that, the microphone went dead. The transponder of the plane went off. That's a device that radios information out to the radar, so controllers could only watch the blip. They could no longer tell what altitude the plane was at. There were several cell phone calls from relatives on board planes who reached their relative on the ground. One reported the terrorists had knife-like instruments. And there was one unconfirmed report that an American Airlines flight attendant actually reached her company to say that terrorists had killed the crew of her plane. Whatever else, we may know some more from the cockpit voice recorders, which could have survived those crashes and would give us an actual recording of what was going on for audio in the cockpits. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager. At the Pentagon right now, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Henry Schultz. Let's hear what he has to say.
Our intense focus on recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman,
that is
preceding Carl Levin,
General Shelton, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, talking about the institution strong and our unity is strong as war. We are on a war footing, in effect, in this country, even though there has been no official declaration of any kind. But from a military point of view, political point of view, and certainly from a psychological point of view, we are at war with these terrorists. The question is, who are they? Within the intelligence community, all the fingers are pointing at Osama bin Laden, the very wealthy Saudi dissident who has been harbored by the Taliban, it's widely believed, in Afghanistan. Let's get more tonight on the continuing speculation about who is responsible from NBC's Andrea Mitchell now at her post in the nation's capital. Andrea?
Tom, tonight U.S. intelligence officials are mobilizing worldwide to try to find the culprits and make sure that they don't strike again. An attack on America coordinated with military precision, 4 planes, split-second timing, penetration of airports and airspace, no warning.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
The first question tonight, is it over? The terrible answer, despite billions spent on U.S. intelligence, the nation's top experts do not know where or when terrorists will strike next.
The problem is that they are hard to penetrate. They are located in places that we're very hard-pressed to get any kind of information out of. And as hard as our agencies have tried, they've had some success. You don't hear about that. We only hear about the failure.
Who could have done this? Before today, the worst failure, the attack on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa 3 years ago. Again, perfectly timed, no warning, 224 dead. The alleged mastermind, America's most wanted terrorist, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden also involved, U.S. officials say, in helping the man convicted of bombing the World Trade Center, Ramzi Youssef, 9 years ago, by protecting Youssef before and after that attack. Last winter, CIA Director George Tenet told Congress that bin Laden is capable of multiple attacks with little or no warning.
Osama bin Laden and his global network of lieutenants and associates remain the most immediate and serious threat.
Bin Laden's alleged millennium plots planned attacks on 3 tourist areas in Jordan frequented by Americans, on Los Angeles International Airport, and on a U.S. destroyer in Yemen, all foiled. But 6 months later, terrorists do strike successfully, ram another destroyer, the USS Cole, killing 17. In June, bin Laden brags on this home video of killing U.S. sailors, a remarkable tape made to recruit more terrorists against America. And just 3 weeks ago, a warning to a London newspaper, allegedly from bin Laden's group, that he was targeting America again.
I think it is a dilemma for the United States now. I believe the only thing is, to revise their policies, to look at what's happening. Why, for example, the anti-American sentiment is very high in the Middle East and in the Muslim world.
How could this happen? Only from a massive intelligence failure. But in this case, at least there will be some evidence.
The good news is that the hijacking 4 airplanes is a very complicated operation. Even hijacking 1 is complicated. And they will have left some trail behind them. They will have had to have checked in, and they will have had to have purchased tickets either under their name or alias names.
If the U.S. cracks the case, how will it retaliate? Current and former officials say massively, but carefully.
If we're going to act, we need to be able to convince the world that we were justified in our actions. We had that evidence during the African embassy bombings, and I think it's critical that the intelligence community now begin to develop that with respect to these attacks.
Today, Afghanistan's Taliban leaders deny any involvement by Osama bin Laden. But as David Bloom alluded to earlier, intelligence officials and others are telling NBC tonight that they are 90% sure that bin Laden is involved. And Tom, if that proves to be the case, there is no doubt in anyone's mind that the U.S. will retaliate.
But the question is, how do they find Osama bin Laden, and who do they retaliate against?
They cannot find Osama bin Laden. They have not been able to. He is #1 on the most wanted list of the FBI. They have warned the Taliban that they will respond against Afghanistan's leaders. So the attack would be against Afghanistan. Within the last 3 weeks, they have warned Afghanistan that they will hold the Taliban personally responsible if Osama bin Laden attacks.
Much as it is that this could happen again, there have been a number of red flags that have gone up for years now, but even in Washington at the highest political levels, people have refused to take them as seriously as this day indicates they should have.
Exactly right. I mean, in our report, Senator Warren Rudman, former senator, you spoke to him earlier today. He and Gary Hart, another former senator, had a blue panel commission, a blue ribbon commission. They warned that the nation's defense, the national defense here at home, not overseas, is the greatest vulnerability. That was in February and March. Not much has been done. The bureaucracy moved so slowly, and after the 1998 bombings, Tom, America's embassies were not greatly enhanced in their security, partially, but Congress rejected demands by 2 secretaries of state to beef up security to a much greater level overseas.
Thank you very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. The United States, at once so powerful and so innocent in its worldview in so many ways. Let's go to our Pentagon correspondent now, NBC's Jim Miklaszewski. Jim, you have some information for us about why these particular targets might have been chosen.
Well, these particular targets, first of all, the World Trade Center for its very high profile and the obvious trap that the terrorists set. After the first attack, they knew very well that all television cameras in one of the most media-intensive centers of the world would be focused on those twin towers, so that when that second plane came in with that horrific video of it striking the second tower, that would achieve a monumental victory for them. The target here, obvious. The most powerful, the center of the most powerful military in the world. Tom?
All right, thanks, NBC Jim Miklaszewski. I'm told that Marine One, the helicopter bearing the president from Andrews Air Force Base back to the White House now, is landing on the White House lawn. We do expect to hear from the president before the end of this night. He has had a long and challenging day, beginning in Florida, then going to Louisiana, and then to Offutt Air Force Base, the home of the Strategic Air Command, before returning here to his office at the White House this evening. He'll be meeting with his national security advisors. By then, Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, may be back from his trip to Peru. Also, Condoleezza Rice, who's been in the White House all day long and informed him of all of this. And Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, Vice President Dick Cheney, who has managed to stay in the White House, too. These are the kinds of days that you know in the back of your mind may occur when you become the President of the United States and the Commander-in-Chief when you're on the campaign trail. But the cold, hard reality has been visited on this president, one of the greatest national security crises this country has faced in many, many years within his first year in office. So let's just watch for a moment and see if we can't see the president as he gets off the helicopter, and then under very heavy guard. There's extraordinary security now at the White House. Sharpshooters on the roof, people have been cleared out. Our correspondents are operating from across the street. We'll see whether we can see him as he moves from Marine One into the Oval Office. Mick, we had, as we expected earlier today, the president had a fighter plane escort coming from Omaha back to Washington, and my guess is that he must have had one earlier today when he left Florida and also when he went from Louisiana up to SAC. Jim,
it was shortly after the attacks occurred on the World Trade Center that the Pentagon went into a crisis mode. They were trying to establish exactly what additional threats there may be, and then it was just about 28 minutes after that that the airplane hit here. It was after the attack on the Pentagon that the Air Force then decided to scramble F-16s out of the D.C. National Guard Andrews Air Force Base to fly cover, a protective cover over Washington, D.C. It was something straight out of a war zone, Tom. One Air Force officer standing next to me looking up in the sky at the F-16 said, "My God, we're flying cover on the nation's capital."
All right, Jim, let's continue to watch here as the president still is on Marine One. We do expect that momentarily he'll be exiting that helicopter and moving briskly into the Oval Office. Laura Bush, he had talked to earlier today. She had been moved to a secure location. His brother Jeb Bush declared a state of emergency in the state of Florida after the president left today, a contingency that a lot of governors took around the country. Secret Service detail exiting first. There were Secret Service offices and a number of other government offices in the World Trade Center. There's the president now, walking to what will prove to be one of the longest and most important nights of his presidency. Back into the White House Oval Office. We do expect him to address the nation later. His father, obviously, was president during the Operation Desert Storm, the Persian Gulf War. His father had been the ambassador to the United Nations, director of the CIA, and vice president of the United States for 8 years before he occupied the Oval Office. There is very little in your experience as governor of Texas or even as a senator of the United States or almost any other job to prepare you for these kinds of occasions. Let's go to NBC's Campbell Brown. Campbell, what can you tell us about the plans for tonight?
Well, Tom, we're not sure as of yet exactly what time the president will be addressing the nation, but now that we do know that he is back at the White House, he will likely be joining the vice president and the National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice in a room, what's referred to as the Situation Room in the White House. This is a wood-paneled room, extremely secure, in the basement of the West Wing. And in that room is a giant conference room. Around a big table, there are 10 chairs. There are about 20 chairs around the perimeter of the room. And there are 2 giant video screens that can open up where the president and his team can meet and essentially watch all of the communications coming in from around the country, or around the world, rather. Right next to that conference room is a special communications center where 4 people are on staff 24 hours a day, military, State Department, intelligence, who are sifting through all the cables, all the information, providing them instantly to the president and his team. That's where the vice president's been all day with the National Security Advisor and other key personnel. In all likelihood, the president is joining them there now to get an update before he addresses the nation. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. And at his side, he will have veterans of other crises in the national security of this country. Vice President Dick Cheney was Defense Secretary during the Persian Gulf War. Donald Rumsfeld served as Defense Secretary before and also as White House Chief of Staff. Condoleezza Rice has been on the staff of the National Security Council during President George Herbert Walker Bush's administration, President 41 Bush, as they like to describe him. Now back here in New York, as you can see behind me, the billowing smoke, the continuing dust and debris from the collapse of the World Trade Center earlier today, and then Trade Center number 7, a 40-story building that went down. But the World Trade Center, one of the targets of the terrorists today, is one of the most distinctive architectural edifices in the world. The world's largest commercial complex, completed in 1976, an architectural marvel. Its details immense. A massive twin structure, 110 stories tall, built of 600,000 square feet of glass and 200,000 tons of steel, 1,350 feet tall, 43,000 windows, 99 elevators, and a home for 1,200 businesses. Businesses where 50,000 people work. Businesses that include commodity exchanges, investment firms, law firms, banks, restaurants, a hotel, government offices, a top and observation deck, a renowned tourist attraction. The Trade Center could draw 90,000 additional visitors on a busy day. Today, the Twin Towers, many of those inside, gone. That's just one of the many reasons, of course, that today will be remembered as one of the worst days in the nearly 400-year history of the great city of New York. And NBC's Pat Dawson has been on the streets of New York, very near the World Trade Center throughout most of the day. He's been witness to the heroic rescue efforts that were effected there today. And of course, tonight, Pat, still an unknown number of dead trapped there in the rubble.
Very true, Tom. Police, fire, and emergency workers first on the scene this morning knew they had a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. What they didn't realize is that after they arrived, it would get worse, and that many of them would be victims as well. Within minutes of the attack, New York rescue crews responded. Dozens of emergency workers running headlong into the chaos, a swirling mass of fire and smoke more than 60 stories up. Chief Albert Turry of the New York Fire Department was one of the first on the scene.
The initial reaction was that it was an absolute terrorist attack.
His job, direct a rescue effort inside the Trade Center. His team of 200 firefighters fanned out into the burning towers to search for survivors.
When that first tower fell, I was trying to evacuate everybody 3 blocks north, away from every high-rise building in the area.
But when the towers started crumbling, crashing all around them, the original rescue effort became an exercise in survival, the rescuers themselves running for their lives.
But I'm telling you right now, there wasn't time to evacuate our people.
Most of those that did make it out of the Trade Center covered in debris, ghostly figures coughing and vomiting from the smoke and dust.
It was the most horrific scene I've ever seen in my whole life. We saw the World Trade Center in flames, a big gaping hole all the way on the top of it. We could see people jumping from the top of the building.
At midday, the financial district of Lower Manhattan looks like a war zone. With no idea if another attack is imminent, hundreds of companies throughout New York send their workers home. Bridges and tunnels across the Hudson River are closed. Mass transit shut down.
There are over 1,000 rescue workers, probably about 2,000 that are deployed, trying to get into the buildings, trying to find people, trying to search for people. The governor and I spoke a couple of hours ago. The governor has deployed the National Guard to relieve them because our people are going to need reinforcements pretty soon. But right now they don't want to leave because they're searching for innocent citizens, and they're searching for some of their brothers and sisters.
When rescuers finally got inside the trade towers, the damage left many of them shocked at the near total devastation. There's no way to estimate casualties. Thousands are believed dead. For those used to saving lives, the frustration is overwhelming.
When you start talking to a New York police officer and they start crying for what they've seen in the last couple hours, you know the seriousness and the gravity of the situation.
Throughout the day, rescuers have faced a terrible choice with hundreds, perhaps thousands of people trapped in the rubble in there. When is it safe to go back in? And Tom, the most vivid example of that, referred to by David Bloom a little while ago, that, of course, the loss of Building 7 of the World Trade Center just over my shoulder, which tumbled to the ground 8 hours after this attack began. Tom?
NBC's Pat Dawson in Lower Manhattan tonight, and of course, for many of the people who lived through all of that, it will be one of the unforgettable moments of their lives. NBC's Ann Thompson was in the vicinity of the World Trade Center when the buildings began to come down. Ann?
Tom, this is the view tonight down West Broadway. Smoke's filling the air where the 2 towers in building number 7 stood. In the last hour, we have seen busloads of police, of doctors, and ambulance after ambulance go into that area to try to repair a city that's been mortally wounded by this attack. A direct hit that shattered New York City's confidence.
Well, as soon as the first building collapsed, everybody made a mad dash to just take cover.
And everybody just started running. I just happened to duck right into the both of them.
As soon as we got out of the train station, people were screaming and crying and yelling, and it was just total chaos. And the bottom of our building was blown out.
For me, Ground Zero, Fulton and Broadway, about 2 blocks from the World Trade Center, just as the South Tower crumbled. Hollywood could never imagine something like this. A tidal wave of smoke and debris came roaring down Broadway. I was standing at the corner of Fulton and Broadway. I ran into a building, ran between a column and a building at 195 Broadway, and pushed my face and my body into that building. For what seemed like 5 minutes, I was pelted with all kinds of debris. I crouched down, was coughing, trying to breathe. You couldn't get any air. The air was so full of smoke and dust. When it finally settled, I stood up. My glasses were covered with dust. Hours later, I'm still covered with dust. The building that I was in front of, 195 Broadway, the doors were gated shut. They opened the doors, let us in, and inside we were finally able to breathe. It wasn't easy. My eyes were filled with dust. My mouth was filled with dust. I was choking. The people I was with were choking. It was just absolutely horrific. All I could think of was, this is war.
I just heard the rumble, and then I ran like hell, and there was a large wind coming.
Down here, panic. Survivors flee by whatever means they can, fearing more destruction at any moment. At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
Everyone, please clear the corner.
Palpable fear as people run through the streets, choking on dust and debris.
You gotta chase it. Come on, let's go, let's go.
We saw the building come down. We all ran, and the walkway held up to save like 40 or 50 of us that were right there. We were buried there, and then cops shot out windows in the next building. It was the only thing that was in front of us was like these 1-inch windows.
The streets of the financial district covered with debris, in some cases ankle deep. Cars on fire, cars just turned by the force of the explosion. It was like something no one had ever seen. Panic, like smoke, heads uptown. Officials ordering precautionary evacuations of some of New York City's landmarks.
This is an orderly evacuation of 30 Rockefeller Plaza.
On the street, anxious commuters trying to call home, cell phone service dead. At Grand Central Station, travelers desperate to get out of the city.
It's going to take a long time, but you're going to see Mama and Papa today, okay?
Outside the station, a surreal scene. People buying postcards of the Twin Towers that no longer exist. As the day wears on, witnesses who survived the attack now face a new horror, searching for missing friends and co-workers.
We can't account for all of our employees. We're just in a state of shock.
The biggest, busiest city in the world, the attack revives fears of the 1993 bombing. Suddenly, nowhere in the financial district seems safe. Did you ever think this could happen again?
No, I really didn't. I lived through the first one.
After a tragedy so great, tonight a city comes together, searching for safety and comfort. Tom, now this area is more than just a business district. It is also where people live. And within the last hour, we have seen families bringing suitcases, crates carrying their family pets to leave and to go elsewhere. They have no water, they have no gas, and there is also the fear that more buildings will collapse. The area is covered by police from all over New York City, and they tell us that they will be here through the night. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Ann Thompson. But let me ask you, after you finally emerged from that building, what about other people who could not get into a building? What kind of casualties did you see?
Tom, I will tell you that when I walked out of the building on Broadway and headed down towards Canal, it was as if there had been a blizzard of debris and dust all over the street. I saw people running. I was walking. There were a lot of rescue people there, but there were people injured. I saw a woman being carried by two men. It was like something I had never seen anything like it, and all I could think of was just to get away from there, to get to safety. And as I kept walking to Canal Street, I could hear yet another explosion behind me. It was truly one of the most frightening moments I've ever lived through.
Thanks very much, NBC's Ann Thompson. Any number of NBC News personnel were caught in all of that today. Among them, our producer Mary Beth O'Toole and correspondent Rahema Ellis. And they provided us tonight with a kind of a video diary. We'd like to share that with you now. Well, we'll hope to get back to Rahema Ellis. Obviously, we're having some difficulty with what has been going on with the audio part of our broadcast tonight in that particular videotape. This is a live picture looking across New York Harbor, and I'll ask your forbearance and patience here because we are doing the very best we can under, as you might expect, some very trying circumstances. That's looking across from the other side, from the New Jersey side, at the lower end of Manhattan. That is a picture that has been going on all day, but when it began, there were the two 110-story towers of the World Trade Center. They are now gone from the Manhattan skyline. It's still a stunning thought to realize that they have been brought down so coldly and so efficiently in such a cold-blooded fashion by these hijacked airliners in this terrorist attack. Another colleague who captured some of the most horrifying moments today is Christian Martin. He's a native New Yorker and he's a producer at Dateline. He had his own camera with him when the buildings began to come down.
And I saw a tourist with a video camera, so I said, let me buy that from you. I took a shot of a huge wheel of a plane lying in the middle of the avenue. There was all these sort of white sheets in the middle of the street, which took me a minute to figure out what those were. I mean, the collapse happened 10 minutes after I got the camera. I shot a couple of shots of the building burning. I was shooting the building, and the building started to collapse, and that happens pretty slowly. Everyone gets into the job for adventure. This turned sour pretty fast. I was down in Oklahoma City, and I got there about 4 hours afterwards, and that was pretty chaotic. This was about 1,000 times worse and more chaotic than that. And then, the cop was like, run, run, just to save my life. I had literally a mouthful of soot. You couldn't see. It was just... And then people were just remarkable. I mean, everyone was just in a horrible, horrible place. You couldn't see. Everyone was hurt. I was so lucky. So lucky. So much luckier than so many other people. I mean, you just cannot overemphasize how many completely innocent, beautiful people were just, destroyed by this.
One of our producers, Christian Bernard, tonight, in his own words, he was there in the middle of it. Christian Martin is a producer for Dateline. He managed to buy a camera from a tourist and then almost lost his life as he was trying to record what was going on down there. We want to tell you that momentarily we do expect to hear from the Attorney General of the United States, John Ashcroft, who does have supervisory responsibility for the FBI. He's our chief law enforcement officer. And also from the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, the former governor of Wisconsin. He'll be dealing with a lot of the relief that is going on. Behind me, you can see the dusk is now beginning to settle over the city of New York, and the billowing smoke is still emanating from the lower part of Manhattan, the site of what was once two towers, each 110 stories high. 20,000 people, we believe, are in them at that time when they were attacked today. And the 40-story 7 Trade Center now missing from the Manhattan skyline. We're going to see if we can't get Rahema Ellis back. She was with Mary Beth O'Toole today. They had a kind of a video diary. So let's join that now. We may have to come out of it as we go to Attorney General Ashcroft. But let's hear from Rahema.
New York City's Brooklyn Bridge, normally clogged with vehicles, today an escape route. It's 11:45 in the morning, and there is a mass exodus from downtown New York City. You can take a look, and you can see hundreds of thousands of people leaving the area.
These heinous acts of violence are an assault on the security of our nation. They are an assault on the security and the freedom of every American citizen. We will not tolerate such acts. We will expend every effort and devote all the necessary resources to bring the people responsible for these acts, these crimes, to justice. Now is the time for us to come together as a nation to offer our support, our prayers for victims and for their families, for the rescue workers, for law enforcement officials, for every one of us that has been changed forever by this horrible tragedy. The following is a summary of the known facts surrounding today's incidents. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles, hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco, was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Crime scenes have been established by the federal authorities in New York, in Washington, D.C. area, in Pittsburgh, in Boston, and in Newark. The full resources of the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the U.S. Marshals Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Office of Justice Programs are being deployed to investigate these crimes and to assist survivors and victim families. Thousands of FBI agents in all of the field offices across the country and in the international Legat offices, assisted by personnel from other Department of Justice agencies, are cooperating in this investigation. The FBI has established a website where people can report any information about these crimes. That address is www.ifccfbi.gov. That address again, www.ifccfbi.gov. Individuals can report any information they know about these crimes to that website. It takes courage for individuals to come forward in situations like this, and I urge anyone with information that may be useful and helpful to authorities to use this opportunity. The Office of Victims of Crime has established a toll-free 800 number for family and friends of victims. They can call 800-331-0075 to leave contact information for a future time when more information is available, to find out information about a victim, or to find out information about the rights of victims and the services available to victim survivors and victim families. The determination of these terrorists will not deter the determination of the American people. We are survivors, and freedom is a survivor. A free American people will not be intimidated, nor will we be defeated. We will find the people responsible for these cowardly acts, and justice will be done. Tommy?
Every single American lost something today. And every one of us at this time expresses our deepest sympathy to the victims of today's tragedies and their families. It is now our mission to begin the healing from this tragedy. From the moment that we learned of these attacks, the Department of Health and Human Services has begun readying teams and resources to be sent to New York City and the Washington area to meet any needs of state and local officials. So far, we have sent 4 disaster medical teams to New York City, and 3 of these disaster medical teams to the Washington, Northern Virginia, Baltimore area. These medical teams each consist of about 35 physicians, nurses, and emergency medical technicians. They are all trained to deal with traumatic injuries and other emergency needs. We've also sent 4 disaster mortuary operational response teams to New York and 3 to the greater Washington area. We're also in the process of shipping a great deal of emergency medical supplies to New York City with the help of the Centers for Disease Control. In short, we're making the full force of the Department of Health and Human Services, both its resources and medical expertise available to the areas that need our assistance. We've also this afternoon activated the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, which consists of approximately 6,000 health professionals. We also are giving backup assistance to the 500-bed ship Comfort from the United States Navy. Americans all over are calling up and asking what they can do. The best thing they can do is respond to this great call by volunteering to give blood. We need Americans to continue to answer that call. No matter where you live, please do your civic duty and assist us by donating blood. It is our primary job is to make sure Americans harmed by this tragedy get the help that they need. We will remain in constant contact with the governors, the mayors, public health officials, and other local officials to make sure that all their needs are being met. It is a sad day, but America and all of its citizens certainly share tonight in the grief that has been caused. And as the President and everybody in his administration have said, we, the government, will continue to operate and continue to provide the services to all Americans.
Secretary of Health and Human Services Tommy Thompson with John Ashcroft, who is the Attorney General of the United States, talking about the role of the federal government now in tracking down those people who are responsible for today's attacks, and then the process of healing physically and psychologically and politically this country. Big part of the story today, the medical response. Witnesses kept saying the scene today was like a war zone. In fact, one of the rescue workers said, "I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything quite like all of this." New York area has first-rate medical facilities, and many of them, and NBC's Robert Bazell was at one of them today, and he joins us now. Robert?
Tom, within minutes of the first explosion, thousands of doctors and nurses at hundreds of hospitals around the New York City area responded with emergency plans to the biggest medical crisis this city has ever faced. At the scene of the explosions and building collapse, emergency workers set up triage sites to put the dead aside and move the most critically wounded to area hospitals. The closest trauma center to the World Trade Center is St. Vincent's in New York's Greenwich Village. A steady stream of ambulances began minutes after the explosion and continued through the day with many kinds of injuries.
Several fractures, several patients have already been to the operating room, and because of the intense fire and smoke, multiple patients with inhalation injuries, and they're being monitored in critical care units.
Medical staff stood prepared to meet each ambulance, some carrying many injured. This one hospital sent out a call for blood donors, and within minutes, so many volunteers appeared that the hospital was swamped and arranged for buses to take donors to other hospitals.
What if you know you just owe and you're not sure whether you're negative or positive?
More than 400 casualties were taken across the Hudson River to hospitals in New Jersey and Staten Island.
What next? Oh my God.
Among the first casualties, about 1 in 5 were rescue workers, firefighters, police, and EMS technicians involved in the rescue effort. Many of the rescuers, hardened by years of tragedies, said they had never seen anything as bad.
They turned in tonight for about 2 or 3 minutes, and took an inventory myself and went about.
As of late this evening, the total number of casualties taken to all area hospitals stands near 1,000. And that number is very low because rescue workers expect that there are still thousands of people buried underneath all of that rubble. And all of the doctors and nurses expect that they are going to be treating casualties from the rubble for several days to come. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Robert Bazell tonight. Now let's go back to Washington. It was the scene of the third hit, of course, a direct hit on the emblem of American military power, the Pentagon, the headquarters for our military services. An estimated 100 casualties there on the ground. 64 were on the plane that hit it, including a prominent Washington lawyer. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski. Well, before we get to that, we're going to go to the congressional leadership. Jim, if you'll just stand by at the Pentagon, Jim Miklaszewski will be coming back to you momentarily. Let's go now to the Hill, and Tom Daschle is the Senate Majority Leader.
To justice. We, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, stand strongly united behind the President and will work together to ensure that the full resources of the government are brought to bear in these efforts. Our heartfelt thoughts and our fervent prayers are with the injured and the families of those who have been lost.
Now, House Speaker Dennis Hastert, who's third in line in succession.
We know, as a nation, as we said, our thoughts and prayers are with those families and those injured and those who are the casualties of today's attack. We also remember those thousands of people who are rescue workers. We'd ask now that we all bow our heads in a moment of silence and remembrance. Thank you.
A rare and welcome bipartisan gathering of the Republican and Democratic leadership of the United States Senate and the House of Representatives.
This is wild.
From the mountains to the prairies to the ocean, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
On the steps of the U.S. Capitol, men and women, black, white, and Asian, conservatives and liberals and independents from all corners of this country, a spontaneous demonstration of unity, a declaration of support for the President of the United States, and a very important symbolic message to be sending around the world and to this country at this hour. NBC's Tim Russert is our Washington bureau chief. Tim, Washington has been riven in recent years by petty political divisions, but this is bound to have a big impact on the ability of Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, to say nothing of the other political players in this country, to find common ground.
Tom, the rancor and partisanship in Washington disappeared immediately. Such national unity as just demonstrated in the steps of the Capitol. Remember, 24 hours ago, it was the Bush tax cut, the Bush budget, the Bush economy. You don't hear any of that tonight. It's America's enemy. America's under attack. Tomorrow, the Congress will convene. Almost an act of defiance saying, we are here standing strong, Democrats and Republicans arm in arm. It's a very, very important message, not only for the world and the terrorists, but for our own nation as well. And it's quite welcome, frankly, by many people who've been covering a Congress constantly bickering with one another almost every issue. Tonight they have found, in a very tragic way, a common bond because out of the necessity of protecting our country and our values.
Thanks very much, NBC's Tim Russert. Every generation of politicians has, in its own way, Tim, a test of its steel and its strength and its long view for this country. But I think that it's worth also pointing out that whatever happens in Washington in the next several days, that America is going to be changed by the events of this day. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklaszewski now, who is at the Pentagon across the river, of course, from the nation's capital. He was there in his office this morning when he heard an explosion and told us immediately he didn't know for sure what it was. We later learned, of course, Jim, it was the unthinkable, a hijacked airliner that had crashed into that building.
Back here, fresh flames are flickering from the roof of the building. Rescue workers continue to search the bombed-out portion of the Pentagon. It's believed that scores of dead are still buried beneath the rubble. No exact death toll has been yet released here, but a temporary morgue has been set up at the courtyard at the center of the Pentagon complex.
And the dead. This was the second target in a well-coordinated act of terrorism.
At 9:15, after the second plane hits the World Trade Center, the Pentagon puts together a crisis action team to assess any additional threats. 9:30, American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757 with 62 people on board, takes off from Dulles Airport for Los Angeles. Believed hijacked, it heads instead for the Pentagon. 9:38, flying low alongside the Pentagon, it banks sharply 90 degrees, flips on its right side, and slams into the Pentagon's lower 2 floors on the southwest side, exploding on impact as horrified commuters watch.
I saw a plane going down, big plane, commercial liner type, going down full speed and just inside the side of the Pentagon.
Panicked employees evacuate by the thousands. The plane slices deep into the lower Pentagon, leaving a gaping black hole of destruction. The upper floors later collapse, burying hopes any more survivors will be found alive. At the opposite end of the Pentagon, well out of harm's way, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was at his desk.
Secretary Rumsfeld was in his office at the time the plane hit the Pentagon and proceeded down towards the impact point in the building. It actually went outside the building and was helpful in getting several people that were injured onto stretchers.
It was 4 hours before the fire is brought under control and rescuers enter the building in search of more dead or possible injured. In a scene straight out of a war zone, F-16, scrambled by the National Guard, fly cover over the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. But the attacks appear over, the unspeakable deed done.
And a short time ago, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hugh Shelton, expressed America's resolve with a firm pledge to retaliate against those responsible. The #1 suspect, Osama bin Laden. Now, the military has always had contingency plans for attacks against a variety of bin Laden targets. Behind me and what's left of this building here tonight, the military is literally dusting off those plans. Tom?
NBC's Jim Miklaszewski. Jim, around the world, American military forces still on the highest status of alert?
The highest state of alert, Delta. And a short time after that, military commanders all around the world took the responsibility, went to Delta, which puts those forces on a virtual war footing, prepared for anything.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon tonight. As New York was a target and thrown into chaos in Los Angeles, it was a city stunned by the attack and the fact that 3 of the 4 hijacked airliners were bound for Los Angeles, the other for San Francisco, California. NBC's George Lewis is at Los Angeles International Airport tonight with some of the grieving families and the latest on some of the crash victims that we know about. George?
Yes, Tom, a lot of grieving going on here on the West Coast because all of the people who were lost on those planes were bound for California. Ordinarily, Los Angeles International has 2,100 flights daily, but tonight the airport's completely buttoned up. Nothing taking off or landing.
Please. Shocked and grief-stricken, the relatives of those aboard the hijacked flights rushed to the airport, where authorities quickly took them to private rooms. Grief counselors from the Salvation Army joined airline personnel in trying to comfort the families of the passengers.
It's just to be there and to say to them, we are here, and we'll do whatever we can do to help you through this trauma and this pain.
The first plane to crash into the World Trade Center, American Airlines Flight 11, was bound from Boston to Los Angeles, piloted by 52-year-old John Oganowski. This afternoon, his brother spoke to reporters.
I ask all of you for your prayers.
for, as I refer to him as Brother John. And I ask you to also pray for our whole country today.
Among the well-known passengers on the hijacked planes, the producer of the TV series Frasier, David Angel, and CNN commentator Barbara Olson, wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. She reportedly called her husband twice on a mobile phone to tell him her plane was being hijacked, that the crew and all the passengers were being herded to the back of the aircraft. And on United Flight 93 from Washington to San Francisco, one of the flight attendants, Cece Myers, also used a cell phone to report that hijacking to her husband, a policeman in Fort Myers, Florida. By midday in Los Angeles, FBI personnel were swarming over the airport checking for possible bombs, but none were found. As a precaution, police and the FBI ordered the airport evacuated.
We're evacuating all terminals and we're stopping traffic all over.
An eerie scene at Los Angeles International tonight, the airport completely empty. And why were all of the hijacked planes California bound? One theory is that the hijackers deliberately chose planes that would have been fully loaded with fuel for a transcontinental flight. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's George Lewis tonight. Now let's go to the reaction around the rest of the country. This day of terror rippling from coast to coast. NBC's Jim Avila is at the Sears Tower in downtown Chicago. Jim?
Tom, Chicago's skyline intact but virtually empty tonight as America's skyscrapers were evacuated through most of the day today. That includes Chicago's Sears Tower, the Arco Towers in Los Angeles, the Bank of America in San Francisco, all waiting for the all clear. The nation's landmarks, America's gathering spots, today abandoned as potential terrorist targets, from the Seattle Space Needle and LA City Hall in the west, to Disney World in the southeast, to the world's biggest shopping mall, the Mall of America in Minneapolis, closed. And of course, at the country's tallest building, Sears Tower, and Michigan Avenue in the Midwest, the symbols of American life frozen in fear.
It's scary. Your family away from home, your kids at school, so it's very scary.
America hunkered down. Chicago's financial district virtually empty. Every sworn police officer in the third largest city ordered to the streets. The nation's workforce turning around and heading home. Larry Hudson works at the Sears Tower.
And I got to the elevator and I said, hey, what am I going up for?
Kelly and David McLean split up to go to work this morning and quickly decided home in front of the television set was the safest spot today.
Now this nation has turned, it's turned upside down. Emotionally, perhaps financially, who knows? It's absolutely, it's one of those moments that you can't believe you actually saw played out.
At America's 5,000 airports, total shutdown.
Ground stop for all airports until 1 o'clock. That means that no airplanes will be leaving any of the airports in the United States.
An estimated 200,000 passengers stranded. At O'Hare, world's busiest, a line of jets held on the runway for hours. No open gates, but surprisingly few complaints.
Being upset about missing my plane, that's trivial compared to people that were on the plane and in the buildings.
Military planes like this one in San Francisco escorting the last of the commercial jetliners safely to the ground. But a crippled air travel system is more than inconvenience. Aviation expert Mike Boyd.
Air transportation is part of our communication system. Today, it's shut down entirely. People aren't moving A to B. Goods aren't moving. Mail isn't moving. And because of that, we're probably going to have a tens of billions of dollar hit on our economy for this quarter.
Phone service strangled too. America's largest cell phone network, with cell towers atop the World Trade Center destroyed, reports call volume nationally doubled.
We can't compare today's events to anything that we've experienced before. We've withstood earthquakes, hurricanes, significant floods, but nothing like today's event.
Get the 12 extra right here.
In Chicago, 800 miles from the attacks, Karen Davis frustrated in her attempt to work at home.
I could not get a signal on my way home, and then I couldn't get a signal on my home phone when I got here. Just really frustrating not to be able to get in contact with anybody.
Among the events canceled tonight, Major League Baseball postponing games from coast to coast. NBC's Tonight Show called off, and the Emmys, scheduled for Sunday, canceled too.
we all could see the gravity of the situation and realize this is a true national nightmare come true, and that a celebration and a comedy show would just not be something that would be appropriate for this country this weekend.
We cannot let it happen again.
Most of the nation's schools stayed open through the tragic day, students watching terrorism on their own shores for the first time.
And I just was asking myself over and over why they did this.
Teachers trying to make sense of it.
There are other places in the world where this is commonplace, and for us it's a first.
At this hospital in suburban Chicago, Americans responding by lining up to donate blood. Midday church services more crowded than normal.
I guess I'm just looking for a peace in my heart and for peace in other people's hearts and from all the destruction.
Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?
At SMU in Dallas, older students sing the national anthem at an outdoor rally, mixing tears and patriotism. Experts say Americans should expect a jump in the national anxiety level.
They may be irritable, they may be really very acutely aware of their environment around them and any kind of threats to them.
Also tonight, some of the first effects of the fear in the economic fashion. Already today, there's been problems with gas gouging. In fact, gas prices have gone up in Kansas to as much as $5 a gallon. Tom?
NBC's Jim Avila tonight reporting on the length and breadth of this country from Chicago, the heartland of America. Told now we have a tracking tape. It shows the pattern of the flight that went into the first of the twin trade towers. It took off from Boston. That would be Flight 11 American Airlines. And then you can see that sharp left turn as it heads for New York, well off course. And the second plane headed now going from New York, and then it lands. This is the second one that comes into New York. The second one goes from Newark to Pennsylvania, where it went down. There's still some uncertainty about whether that was going to be directed by the hijackers into one of the other many government or financial buildings that could have been a target for it, either in the Washington, D.C. or New York area. We don't know for sure. Of course, for many Americans tonight, the anger and the rage that they feel is directed at one man that they have never seen except on some vague videotape. Osama bin Laden, the world's best-known Islamic extremist. He's on almost everyone's list of the most likely suspects for today's attacks, and NBC's Keith Miller has more on him tonight from London for us. Keith?
Tom, he is one of the most dangerous terrorists on the planet. The U.S. government has put a $5 million bounty on his head. Osama bin Laden was last seen publicly this January at his son's wedding in Afghanistan. Rare pictures of a man who reportedly travels only at night, often in disguise, surrounded by bodyguards. He made his reputation in the 1980s, fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
He was involved in some horrific battles, which he said later gave him a sort of tranquility and a sense of peace, and it basically made him a pretty fearless guy.
Today, the Central Intelligence Agency calls him the most immediate and serious threat to U.S. security. Bin Laden says the jihad against the United States and killing of Americans is the core of his faith. He was born into a family of wealth, power, and privilege in Saudi Arabia 44 years ago. It was during his days as a student studying economics that he turned to radical Islam. He is linked to a series of global terrorist attacks. February 1993, the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, 6 dead, more than 1,000 injured. August 7, 1998, the simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, more than 200 killed. And last year, the suicide bomb attack on the USS Cole, resulting in the death of 17 American servicemen.
He alone, probably within the Islamic world, has amassed and developed a terrorist network, an international network, which would be capable of carrying out such an atrocity.
After the embassy bombing, the American government retaliated with missile strikes. The missiles damaged bin Laden's headquarters in Afghanistan, but he escaped unharmed. The U.S. has demanded that the radical Islamic government in Afghanistan hand bin Laden over to American authorities. But the Afghans have refused, despite bin Laden's declaration that all U.S. citizens are legitimate targets.
He's targeted the US because he sees America as the head of the snake, as he calls it. The body of the snake is the corrupt governments in the Middle East that he has promised to overthrow, and also Israel.
Meanwhile, his popularity in the region is reportedly increasing. Recently, an estimated 25,000 followers scattered around the world and prepared to engage in a holy war against America. From Afghanistan tonight, a statement from the government claiming bin Laden didn't do it. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence officials say he was last seen near Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan, but because he moves at least 3 times a week, he will remain difficult to catch. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Keith Miller tonight. We want to give you an update now. The President of the United States will be addressing this nation on this difficult day at 8:30 Eastern Time tonight. And of course, we will bring that to you live. There are people around the world who do not wish America well. We know that as a result of today's attacks, but also on the basis of their reaction to what happened here today. Some of them are even celebrating. With that story, here's NBC's Martin Fletcher in Tel Aviv. Martin?
Tom, Israel is declaring a day of mourning tomorrow in solidarity with the United States, but not all reaction here has been so sympathetic. There's a sense here among some Palestinians that America had it coming. These Palestinians in East Jerusalem today delighted at the bombings and American loss of life, offering cakes and sweets, calling out, "God is great." Thousands more celebrate in other West Bank towns until Palestinian police disperse them. The Palestinian leader, however, stunned and sympathetic.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
But the voice of the street reflects anger at America's role, especially in Israel and Iraq.
We should show America that they should learn and they should know what is to attack somebody like Iraq. It should be more.
And many Arabs furious at American support for Israel. This man holds up an American-made bomb part fired by American-made aircraft used by Israel. American support for Israel, some believe, makes America a legitimate target for terrorism. Many also angry at years of almost daily American bomb attacks against Iraq, which didn't stop with the end of the Gulf War a decade ago. And US troops still in Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden, the prime suspect in today's terror attacks, angry at American support for what he calls the tyrannical government of Saudi Arabia, his homeland, and for America's close ties with Israel. In almost a year of unrest, more than a dozen Palestinian suicide bombers and other attackers have killed 170 Israelis, while Israel has killed more than 570 Palestinians. A conflict that always threatens to suck neighboring countries into the fighting. Israel tonight called for an international war against terrorism.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life.
Today, the leader of Hamas, the Islamic militants who send most suicide bombers against Israel, called on America to change its policies. Sheikh Yassin said America is behind injustices in many parts of the world, but then he said Hamas doesn't support attacks against civilians. Tonight, Israel closed its airspace to foreign airlines and then closed its land borders to prevent any possible terrorist attacks. There's a sense here that Palestinian militants may try to take advantage of the confusion to kill more Israelis. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Martin Fletcher. An already very complex and volatile situation in the Middle East is even more so tonight. Now to a different kind of problem. The World Trade Center towers were some of the most famous buildings in the world, of course. They've survived hurricanes, fires, and even one previous terrorist bombing. NBC's Roger O'Neill talked to the architect of those buildings and how they were put up and what brought them down.
Hyman Brown was the project engineer on the Twin Towers, the man on the ground in charge of making sure the buildings were built right, the way it was designed.
There was a lot of pride in it, and we were doing something that hadn't been done before. But no one ever considered any types of forces like this.
Brown, who spent 6 years building the towers from day one in 1966, says the planes didn't cause the towers to collapse, but rather the fire and tremendous heat that exposed the steel superstructure to forces it could not withstand.
Structural steel is fireproof to last between 1 and 2 hours, which it did, and then steel melts.
Each tower was built around a central core. That core kept the building up, supporting the tower's so-called dead weight. But when steel melts, according to Brown, like dominoes, it falls. Brown says the towers were built to withstand 200-mile-an-hour hurricanes, the 100-year storm, the worst nature could dish out. But he says an airplane crash never entered anyone's mind. Still, it appears the outside columns, made of prefabricated steel, absorbed most of the energy from the planes and may have kept the 2 towers from collapsing immediately. University of Colorado engineering professor Stein Stur thinks the energy from those large planes would be equivalent to a medium 5 or 6 Richter scale earthquake.
As the airplanes came in and hit, energy was absorbed tremendously. Some of that core may have been damaged tremendously, and maybe this was part cause to this implosion.
The way the towers collapsed seems similar to pictures we've become accustomed to watching, as old buildings like the Kingdome in Seattle are taken down with explosives. Mark Loazza, whose controlled demolition company does that sort of work, says once a building starts falling, it releases a lot of stored energy.
We use explosives as a catalyst to release that potential energy, converts it into kinetic energy, gets the building moving.
NBC's Roger O'Neill tonight on the stunning destruction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center here in Manhattan as a result of a terrorist attack. All hour long, we've been trying to bring you Rahema Ellis and her diary of what she went through during the day, and we're going to do that for you right now.
New York City's Brooklyn Bridge, normally clogged with vehicles, today an escape route. It's 11:45 in the morning, and there is a mass exodus from downtown New York City. You can take a look, and you can see hundreds of thousands of people leaving the area. Police are evacuating this particular area. Were you afraid for your life?
Completely terrified. We were all crying, hysterical. We were wanting to get out of there and not knowing where to go and which direction to run in and how far we can go. And I'm still worried about my life. Yeah, it's horrifying.
Putting civilians on the bus, get on if you want. Another sign of how quickly people deserted the area. This is a fruit stand only about 8 to 10 blocks away from the World Trade Center. Normally there would be people crowded in the streets trying to buy some fruit from a man who may have worked here. Now it's deserted. Nothing is left but his fruit covered in ash. What went through your head when you saw that?
Still completely devastated.
Devastation.
People jumped out of the windows. It was indescribable.
I'm watching the thing, and all of a sudden it starts crashing, this tremendous noise, and instinct obviously tells you to turn the other way and run, which we all did. People were getting trampled and a lot of bleeding.
We're now just a block away from the World Trade Center, and the closer we get to ground zero, the harder it is to breathe and to see. You have to wear a mask, and you need to wear some sort of glasses. Otherwise, it is choking and blinding smoke. Behind me, ordinarily, you would be able to see the Twin Towers, but today, all you can see is the thick black smoke that is clouding the area. All on the street, there is this thick ash. It's at least an inch thick. There are papers strewn all over everywhere. And the area literally is deserted, with the exception of the emergency workers who are continually trying to push people away from the area for their own safety. What do you think this is?
I have no idea.
What your guess is?
Pulverized cement.
Pulverized cement?
Concrete, yeah.
The concrete. These firefighters, just some of the hundreds, waiting for their turn to go into the World Trade Center area. Already they are covered in soot, tired, and worried about what they're going to see when they get to ground zero. What happened to you?
I was inside the building trying to get people out when the building fell.
When do you think that we will be able to begin to go in and start to really search for some of the victims inside?
They're searching right now on a limited basis.
As soon as they get organized, we'll be sending more and more people in to do more and more work.
NYU Downtown Hospital has the only emergency room in Lower Manhattan. The first victims from the blast were brought here. The cafeteria has been turned into a triage area. Hospital officials say there are victims wall to wall. 8 years ago, this hospital took in the first victims from the World Trade Center bombing. Officials here say they try to plan for disasters. 2 weeks ago, they went through an emergency drill, but no one ever imagined they'd be tested so soon. Rahema Ellis, NBC News in Lower Manhattan.
NBC's Rahema Ellis, who is in the middle of it all. We want to remind you that we'll have continuing coverage until 1 tomorrow morning on this NBC station. The President of the United States, his speech to the nation at 8:30 Eastern Time tonight. It has now been about 11 hours since the first attack on the Twin Trade Towers and the stunning sequence of events that followed. It all happened so rapidly and in plain view that it somehow seemed surreal, more a television image than the cold-blooded, calculated acts of terrorism that in fact it was. This is a day without end, for we do not know yet the full price in lives lost, whether there are other targets to come, and most important, how we will respond to this, a terrorist attack, how we strike back militarily, how we defend ourselves at home, how we heal all the wounds of this day. America has been attacked, and it has been changed. This is the first great test of the new century for this nation, for its new president. It's also a great test for us all, wherever we live, whatever our age, whatever our beliefs. Tonight, as we remind you, we'll have continuing coverage. We want to share with you now the images and the sounds of this unforgettably dark day in America. It was the ultimate act of terrorism. 2 hijacked planes crashing into the World Trade Center, collapsing what was once one of the tallest buildings in the world, leaving a scene some described as a nuclear winter. Collapsed as a result of this terrorist attack today. Let's go to NBC's Pat Dawson, who's been on duty there all day long as we await the President of the United States. Pat, very quickly, bring us up to date on recovery efforts.
The recovery efforts at this point, Tom, still pretty much the bottom line is it's a rather chaotic situation here. New York City Fire Department Lieutenant was just giving us some information a few minutes ago and said that there are still fires burning down there, still some underground fires. He told us that there was a rather significant fire in that building that Stone was just describing, number 7 World Trade Center, that collapsed late in the afternoon. As he said, there are still fires burning there. They are trying at this point to get to those fires and to extinguish them, as well as the task, obviously, of looking for anyone who might possibly have survived, although at this point that is a very, very difficult thing to do in the darkness and the smoke and rubble that this fire lieutenant said runs several stories high in there. Just making a point, or coming on about a point that you mentioned before, as the New York City Firefighters Union saying that fully half of the firefighters originally responding to the events early this morning were killed. That would fit with information that we had gotten from one of the chiefs who was in charge of that operation, saying that he knew he had lost at least 50 to 60 men and probably far fewer that he was not able to evacuate. Tom?
All right, thank you, Pat Dawson, bringing us up to date on the rescue efforts that continue underway as we look at the scenes that have been described all day long by so many people who were there either as a war zone or reminiscent of a nuclear winter. The President of the United States will address the nation, presumably from the Oval Office tonight, after certainly the most hectic day of his presidency, one of the most difficult days of any modern president. He began in Florida earlier, went to Shreveport, addressed the nation from there at Barksdale Air Force Base, then to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, to the very secure bunker with all the most sophisticated communications equipment in the world at his disposal for a meeting of the National Security Council. And then he felt strongly that he wanted to come back to the nation's capital, to Washington, D.C. It was symbolically and politically important for him to address the nation from there tonight, that symbol of freedom and power, the Oval Office of the President of the United States in the West Wing of the White House. We'll be sharing with you after we hear from the President also the appearance tonight on the steps of the Capitol of the House and Senate members who were still in town, Republican and Democrat alike, the leaders. There they are, and after their statement by their leaders, they broke into this spontaneous rendition of God Bless America. NBC's Tim Russert is standing by with me as well. Tim, this is going to be a great test, not just for the President, but for his entire staff and, of course, for the political leadership on both sides on Capitol Hill. Let's go now, Tim. I'm sorry, we'll get to that later. Here now is the President of the United States in the Oval Office. We expect to hear from him momentarily.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President George W. Bush, in his second address to the nation, and certainly the most grave speech that he has made in his very young presidency, as he talked tonight about the terrorists attempting to shatter steel and buildings, but not being successful in shattering the steel of resolve in this country, saying the bright light of freedom will continue to burn. He was a sorrowful and sober president, but also one filled with resolve, as he said, we will find the people who are responsible for this and bring them to justice. This has been a long and difficult day for the president, and it's just the beginning, because there are many complex decisions that remain ahead of him now. NBC's Tim Russert joins me now from the Washington Bureau, where he is our Washington Bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press. Tim, the president tomorrow will obviously be sending out a lot of directives to his military, to his law enforcement officers, and also to the people who are responsible for this nation's security at airports and in other places.
Tom, the president cast this tonight as a battle between good and evil, using the word evil several times. Law enforcement officials and intelligence officials hope that with the cockpit recorders, airport records, and perhaps even some celebrations or proclamations by those who did this, they can quickly determine just who must be retaliated against. The president also said something very important, Tom. Whoever harbors these terrorists will be dealt with in the same way as those who committed the terrorism. That is a very important signal and message to people all across the world. Tom, there's a steely resolve in Washington, a passionate determination to bring these people to justice, but there's also a sober realization that our way of life will change forever.
All right, NBC's Tim Russert, who's our Washington Bureau chief. Tim, we're going to ask you to stand by there tonight. I want to go to Richard Holbrooke now, who has been one of our most skilled negotiators and veteran diplomats. He was obviously deeply involved in the Dayton Peace Accords. He was the man who made that happen and tried to bring some sense of peace to the Balkans. Around the world, Mr. Holbrooke, there seems to be this dividing line between Islamic fundamentalists and the United States, not just in the Middle East, but of course in the central part of Europe and in the southeast part of Asia as well.
First of all, I think it's very important to make clear that when you say Islamic fundamentalists, you're not talking about all people who follow Islam as a religion, and I know you and I share that, Tom. But I agree with what Tim Russert just said. The most important sentence in the president's fine speech, which we've all just listened to and which I think the world should understand the president has spoken for the entire nation, regardless of party. The most important sentence in the president's speech was the phrase, we make no distinction between those who committed the act and those who harbor the people who committed it. And it is absolutely critical now that the United States rally an international coalition so that we don't go it alone in seeking out these people. If, as you have been reporting, it comes from Osama bin Laden, and if the Taliban have left him in their country, they must suffer the consequences. And we're going to need the support of our European allies, of the Russians, the Chinese, and of the Arab moderate states like Egypt and Jordan, which all must join us in the effort to eradicate this scourge that is upon us. As Tim Russert said, it's going to be difficult, but it is something that we must do with other countries to isolate the people who did it.
Richard, no one knows better than you that that's a daunting diplomatic assignment. The last time that happened successfully, we had a highly conspicuous presence in Saddam Hussein, who had moved into Kuwait, and President George Herbert Walker Bush, this president's father, and his very skilled team did manage to put together an extraordinary alliance. Will it be more difficult this time?
It will be more difficult, Tom, for a reason that's quite clear. We know what the act of war was, and it is an act of war, but not only do we not know exactly who did it, although we have our suspicions, but finding them will be much more difficult than driving an overt, highly visible force out of Kuwait. And we must remember that it took George Bush Sr. 7 long months from August 1st, 1990 until the beginning of 1991 before he launched that military attack. The American public and the world is going to want some kind of action earlier than that, but we'll have to know who it must be directed against. Still, the President's critical statement just now that we'll make no distinction between those who did it and those who are harboring the men who did it is, I think, a big first step towards changing the rules of the game so that people like this can no longer hide behind the kind of horrible behavior that the Taliban have shown in this situation.
Richard Holbrooke, our former ambassador to the United Nations, former ambassador to Germany, a leading State Department authority, and the principal architect of the Dayton Peace Accords for Bosnia. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Tom.